The official court transcript begins with a single disbelieving question from the defense attorney. Why would a daughter stab her own mother on the happiest day of her life? Those words, stark on the page, set off a chain of disbelief and speculation that rippled through the entire community. Family members stared wide-eyed at the press conference. Neighbors whispered in grocery aisles. Even the officiant, who had pronounced the newlyweds husband and wife, was called in for a statement. Months later, the question still haunted everyone. How did a wedding meant to celebrate new love turn into a scene of betrayal, bloodshed, and a moral quagmire no one could have predicted? What led a bright and promising young bride named Clarissa, who had so many friends, so many hopes, so much going for her, to literally bring the blade down on the woman who gave her life? Behind that single question lay a tangle of suppressed resentments, family secrets, and shifting loyalties that ended in tragedy on a crowded dance floor, with a trembling bride in a white gown and her mother collapsed in a circle of horrified guests. The cameras would later capture the aftermath, paramedics elbowing past half-dazed wedding-goers, tears streaking expensive makeup, the father of the bride leaning against the bar in silent shock. The groom, Jason, was nowhere to be seen in the footage. Rumor had it that he'd run out seconds after the blood hit the floor. In the days that followed, tabloids and mainstream outlets alike had a field day. Bride gone mad, one read. Family ties cut with a knife, quipped another. But beneath the sensational headlines was a story deeper than a moment of sudden rage. As investigators combed through text messages, phone call logs, and confessions, they unearthed emotional triggers that had been building for years. They pieced together an explosive dynamic between Clarissa, her fiancé Jason, and her mother Marianne that teetered on the brink long before the wedding invitations were printed. By the time the wedding day arrived, so many invisible lines had been crossed that a single spark was all it took to set off the conflagration. And in that final moment, the spark ignited in the unlikeliest of places, a supply closet near the banquet hall's kitchen, where an unthinkable betrayal was discovered. This is the cautionary tale of how love, or what passed for it, can twist into something monstrous when trust is broken, how illusions can shatter and leave shards so sharp they slice through everything. It started in the bright suburbs outside Clearwater Heights, a middle-aged neighborhood marked by well-kept lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, and two-story homes that looked almost identical on every street. Clarissa grew up in a house with a pale yellow exterior, an oak tree out front, and that trademark porch swing that squeaked whenever someone moved in it. From the outside, the Davis family looked like the quintessential happy unit. Marianne Davis was a charismatic woman known for her vibrant presence at every neighborhood block party. She had a laugh that could fill a room, a figure she took pride in maintaining through morning jogs, and a famously easy rapport with everyone from the mail carrier to the local city council. Clarissa's father, Daniel, worked as a regional manager at an office supply company. He was dependable, steady, the kind of man who never missed a day of work or a mortgage payment. Their only daughter, Clarissa, excelled academically, played soccer in high school, and carried herself with a kind of self-assured grace that won her many friends, but never turned her into a snob. Neighbors often joked, that's the kind of family you'd see in a sitcom, always smiling and never losing their cool. Behind closed doors, though, tensions simmered. Clarissa remembered arguments sparked by seemingly trivial things, like Marianne's habit of going out for girls' nights that stretched into early mornings, or Daniel's stoic inability to express emotions beyond an occasional grunt of disapproval. There was a sense that Marianne craved something more than the neat suburban life she'd built, while Daniel clung to the idea that predictability was the bedrock of family stability. Clarissa often found herself stepping in as a mediator, using her natural empathy to calm heated conversations. She'd watch her mother's frustrated eyes, see her father's tightened jaw, and try to be the peacekeeper in a household that occasionally threatened to split at the seams. Still, by the time Clarissa turned 18, it appeared her parents had reached an uneasy truce. Marianne stayed faithful to her social scene and daily jogs, Daniel continued his dependable work routine, and Clarissa prepared to head off to college with scholarships that spoke to her future promise. But the conflict beneath that veneer never entirely died. Daniel pretended not to notice whenever Marianne showed up with new clothes he couldn't afford, or came home from a spa weekend that always involved suspicious phone calls she stepped outside to take. Marianne, for her part, feigned disinterest when Daniel worked late for the sixth night in a row, or left on weekend retreats that sounded less professional than personal. Clarissa, stuck in the middle, felt the distance between them widening, like two land masses drifting apart. Yet she remained optimistic. Perhaps all families had these hidden strains, she told herself. Perhaps love and respect were enough to keep them together. The turning point arrived during Clarissa's second year in college when she first met Jason. A business major with an infectious smile, Jason seemed everything Clarissa wanted in a partner. Ambitious, funny, the kind of person who'd hold doors open and remembered her coffee order. Their relationship progressed swiftly. Within months, Clarissa introduced him to her parents over a quiet winter break dinner. Daniel regarded him politely, but with an undercurrent of paternal wariness. Marianne, on the other hand, lit up in Jason's presence, cracking jokes that made her daughter blush and made Daniel cast sideways glances. From the outside, it looked like a typical meet the parents scenario, but Clarissa would recall subtle signs that something was off. She couldn't quite place it at the time. Maybe it was the way Marianne seemed extra playful around Jason, or how Jason's eyes would follow Marianne whenever she moved around the kitchen, but Clarissa dismissed her concerns, chalking them up to nerves. She was just anxious, she reasoned, about whether her mother would overshadow her moment. Marianne had a history of capturing a room's attention without trying. If anything, Clarissa was relieved that her parents didn't outright dislike the man she hoped to spend her life with. Over the next year, Clarissa and Jason's bond deepened. They tackled final exams together, planned weekend getaways, and even talked about future careers. She wanted to go into social work or counseling. He aimed to start his own consulting firm. Every time they visited Clarissa's family home, Marianne sparkled at the sight of Jason. She teased him affectionately, shared guilty laughs with him over cocktails, and sometimes asked for his help with tasks that seemed trivial, like rearranging picture frames or fixing a loose door hinge. Daniel mostly stayed in his corner, content to observe and occasionally grunt a hello. Clarissa sometimes teased Jason, calling him Mom's new son, assuming that Marianne was just excited to have a lively male presence around the house. If there were moments when Jason's hand brushed Marianne's shoulder a bit too long, or his glance lingered, Clarissa told herself she was overthinking. Everyone loved Jason's warmth, his easy charm. Why wouldn't her mother enjoy his company? When Jason proposed to Clarissa on a beach at sunset, capturing it on a friend's cell phone camera, the ring sparkling in the last rays of daylight, she had no reservations. She felt a burst of hope, sure that this was the next step toward leaving behind any lingering family dysfunction. A wedding, a union, a fresh start. They set the date for the following spring. Immediately, planning began in earnest, booking the venue, choosing flower arrangements, finalizing the guest list. Marianne offered her interior design instincts, though Clarissa felt an odd sense of being overshadowed by her mother's enthusiasm. Sometimes she joked, "Mom, you act like you're the one getting married." Marianne would laugh it off, flapping her hand and saying she just wanted to help her only daughter have a perfect day. But tensions flickered. Jason, while busy with his final semester and job interviews, visited Clarissa's parents' home more often than she did. He'd claim he was helping with wedding details, picking up forms, or simply chatting with Marianne about menu ideas. Clarissa thought it was sweet that he was so involved, but every so often she'd notice a strange expression in his eyes when she mentioned her mother. If confronted, Jason would laugh it off, insisting he was just trying to do right by the family he was marrying into. Marianne, too, beamed with compliments about how wonderful Jason was, how he was like a son to her. Still, Clarissa occasionally felt that subtle jolt in her stomach, an intuition that something was off. She pushed it down. This was her wedding, her new chapter, the beginning of what everyone told her would be the happiest years of her life. On the day of the wedding, everything sparkled under the cloudless sky. The ceremony took place in a lush garden behind a well-known event space. Rows of white chairs faced a floral arch, soft music played by a live quartet, the air thick with the perfume of roses and sun-warmed grass. The bride's dress was a simple but elegant off-white gown. Her father walked her down the aisle, blinking back tears. Jason waited at the altar, looking dashing in a black tux, a small smile tugging at his lips. Marianne stood in the front row, radiant in a teal designer dress that hugged her figure. As Clarissa made eye contact with her mother, she caught a wave of complicated emotion passing between them. Pride, yes, but also something else, maybe a flicker of guilt or fear. Clarissa shook off her unease. This was her day. She had to stand tall, vow her love, and embrace the life she'd been waiting to start. The vows went smoothly. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and Jason kissed Clarissa as the guests erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, capturing every moment. The couple retreated to sign papers, share a private grin, and remind each other that this was the best decision they'd ever made. Then the reception began in the adjacent banquet hall, a grand chandelier-lit room with tall windows. The crowd bustled in for cocktails, the DJ spun upbeat tunes, and dinner was served with flair. People toasted the newlyweds with champagne, telling stories about Clarissa's childhood pranks or Jason's funny college antics. Laughter rose in waves. Marianne, meanwhile, glided from table to table like a social butterfly. Daniel stuck to small talk with a few relatives. The tension ratcheted up right after dinner as the dance floor opened and the room lights dimmed to create a party atmosphere. Clarissa noticed Jason had disappeared for several minutes. She assumed he might be in the restroom or grabbing something from their suite. She scanned the crowd for her mother but didn't see her. She headed toward the bar, hoping to find either Jason or Marianne. She needed them for the mother-daughter dance that was supposed to happen soon, followed by the father-daughter dance, then a raucous family celebration. Instead, Clarissa caught a glimpse of one of the waitstaff stepping out of a side corridor looking startled. Their eyes locked, and the waiter quickly looked away, as if they'd seen something they wished they could unsee. In that fleeting gesture, Clarissa felt a sickening certainty grip her. Without quite knowing why, she walked toward that corridor, heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She followed the hallway until she found a small supply closet, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the overhead light was off, casting the space in half shadows. She heard muffled voices, a soft rustling. Her chest tightened. She stepped closer and froze at the sight that would explode her entire reality. Jason pressed against Marianne, lips locked in a frantic, forbidden kiss. Her mother's hands tangled in his hair, the wedding ring Clarissa had just placed on his finger glinting in the dim light. The intensity of their embrace was unmistakable. It wasn't a casual mistake. This was something deeper, something that suggested it wasn't the first time. Clarissa let out a choked sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Jason and Marianne broke apart in horror, turning to see the bride standing there, her white dress still trailing behind her, her expression shattered. Marianne fumbled for words. "It's not what it looks like," she might have said, or maybe "please let me explain," but Clarissa heard nothing. Adrenaline shot through her veins. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal so complete it almost felt surreal, as if the walls might crumble under the weight of such a vile revelation. Jason reached a hand toward Clarissa, eyes wide with desperation. Trying to stammer an apology or explanation she refused to hear. She backed away, spun on her heels, and fled down the hallway. She didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to process the cataclysmic blow she'd just suffered. She felt like she was floating, suspended in a state of shock as she found her way back to the main hall. The music, the chatter, the swirling lights, it all became a cacophony. She saw her father across the room, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. She saw the guests, still oblivious, and all she wanted to do was scream. Her breath came in ragged gasps. A woman she barely recognized, maybe an old family friend, asked her if she was all right, noticing her tear-streaked face. Clarissa jerked away, tears burning hot. She was in her wedding dress, and yet her world had just imploded. Then, somewhere in that chaos, she spotted a decorative knife laid out on a dessert table for the ceremonial cutting of a special cake. She'd seen it earlier and hadn't given it a second thought. Now it gleamed under the colored lights, an inanimate object suddenly brimming with violent possibility. In the swirl of confusion and heartbreak, Clarissa felt a volcanic surge of anger. She could still picture Jason's arms around Marianne, her mother's face turned up to his. Something inside her snapped. She moved toward that knife almost in a trance, her breath ragged, her mind screaming that this couldn't be real. By the time she gripped the ornate handle, she no longer recognized the rational side of herself. She only knew betrayal, humiliation, and a thirst for an immediate, drastic act that would release the agony clawing at her soul. The next moments passed in a blur. Jason, disheveled and frantic, rushed into the hall behind her, calling her name. People started noticing the bride, tears streaming, brandishing a cake knife. But Clarissa's eyes were trained on her mother, who stepped onto the dance floor, face ashen. "Clarissa, please," Marianne said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The apology only fanned the flames of Clarissa's rage. She lunged forward without conscious thought. Guests screamed, tables screeched. Daniel shouted her name, surging forward to stop her, but he was too late. The blade found Marianne's shoulder, slicing through her fancy dress and into flesh. Marianne let out a wail of pain and dropped to one knee, clutching the wound. Blood blossomed on the teal fabric. Chaos erupted. The DJ cut the music, somebody yelled to call 911. The father of the bride tackled Clarissa from behind, wrestling the knife from her hand. She collapsed in a storm of sobs. Jason hovered, face pale, arms outstretched, but powerless to fix the horror he had unleashed. The police arrived with sirens piercing the night. Paramedics tended to Marianne, who was bleeding but alive. Clarissa sat in shock on the floor, her once pristine gown stained with a few drops of her mother's blood. Cell phones captured everything, turning a private heartbreak into an instant viral spectacle. Outside, neighbors who'd been invited to the wedding stared at the paramedics carrying Marianne out on a stretcher. Some turned their cameras to Clarissa, still trembling. Others rushed to comfort Daniel. The groom was missing again, having slipped away the moment Marianne collapsed, as though the weight of his own guilt was too heavy to bear. Red and blue lights flashed across the manicured hedges of the event space, illuminating the once beautiful scene like a macabre stage production. In the following days, the local news stations played the story on a loop. "Bride attacks mother during wedding reception," read the banner across every screen. Tabloid headlines shrieked about scandal and betrayal. The press dug up old stories about Marianne's flirtatious nature, painting her as a seductress who had no boundaries. Others vilified Clarissa, labeling her an unhinged, jealous bride. Jason's name floated around in rumor mills, but he mostly avoided the spotlight, giving only a brief statement that he was shocked and devastated. That line made Clarissa physically ill when she first read it. He was the root cause of the entire nightmare, yet he tried to paint himself as a bystander. Clarissa, now holed up in a friend's small apartment, felt too broken to fight the tidal wave of public opinion. When the police finally arrested her, the charge was aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The only solace was that Marianne's injuries were not fatal. The wedding had become a crime scene, and Clarissa was now the suspect at the center of it. Investigators questioned everyone, the event staff, guests, even the bartenders. They scoured phone records, text messages, emails, trying to piece together how an apparently perfect family event devolved into violence. The story that emerged was even darker than the public realized. Clarissa's meltdown was an isolated explosion, but the relationship between Marianne and Jason had been building for months, if not longer. Some of Jason's text messages to Marianne revealed the affair had begun well before he proposed to Clarissa. Mutual friends admitted they had suspicions when they saw Marianne and Jason slip away at parties, exchange glances across rooms. No one wanted to ruin Clarissa's happiness, so they kept their mouths shut. Now those same friends bore the guilt of wondering if they could have prevented the stabbing had they only spoken up sooner. While Clarissa spent her nights in a county detention facility awaiting bail arrangements, the media pounced on every detail. They uncovered that Marianne had a track record of flirting with younger men, and that Jason had a history of chasing older women when he was in high school. Family acquaintances went on camera speculating about the psychological undertones of the betrayal. "There must have been some deep-seated resentment," one neighbor proclaimed, eyes filled with the thrill of gossip. "Or else maybe Clarissa just snapped. I always thought she was too perfect, you know? Like a kettle boiling over." Meanwhile, Marianne was in a hospital bed with her arm bandaged, refusing to press charges against her daughter. Publicly, she claimed that Clarissa's rage was understandable, if not justifiable. Privately, she wrestled with her own shame and injuries, conflicted about the moral line she'd crossed. She had betrayed her daughter in the worst possible way, and the price was being paid in blood. Her own. As a swirl of rumors and half-truths consumed local headlines, the police dug deeper. They suspected the affair between Marianne and Jason might only be the tip of the iceberg. They interviewed Clarissa over the course of several sessions, and each time, she found herself reeling from conflicting emotions: heartbreak that the man she loved had used her, fury at her mother for stealing away what was supposed to be Clarissa's future, and guilt for losing control so completely. "I don't know who I am anymore," she told the detective at one point, tears streaming. "I never wanted to hurt her. But what else was I supposed to do when I saw them?" He gave a non-committal shrug, as though acknowledging that no training manual covered a betrayal of this magnitude. Court proceedings started with Clarissa being released on a bail bond her father scraped together. The father, who was stoic and distant all these years, now had to piece together the shards of his shattered family. He took Clarissa home, letting her stay in her childhood bedroom, where trophies of a once bright future were displayed on the shelves. The bed still had the same floral quilt from her teenage years. Under that quilt, Clarissa hid herself, reading social media posts about the scandal and ignoring the outside world. News vans occasionally lurked near the home, hoping for a shot of the stabbed mother or the vengeful bride. Some days, Clarissa would glance out the window to find a camera pointed directly at her. She'd flinch and retreat back into the safety of her old posters, her stuffed animals, her memories of a time when everything was simpler. It was during one of those reclusive afternoons that Clarissa's phone buzzed with a blocked number. She didn't want to answer at first, but something told her to pick up. "Clarissa, it's me," came Marianne's voice, weakened by medication and shame. Clarissa froze. She wasn't ready for this conversation, yet she found herself unable to hang up. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence loaded with a million unsaid words. Then Marianne softly said, "I'm so sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but please know I never wanted to hurt you." Clarissa's voice broke when she finally responded, "Then why did you do it? You destroyed everything." Marianne's sobs filtered through the phone. "I was lonely. It's not an excuse, but your father and we haven't been right for years. And Jason was kind. He listened. I know it's disgusting. I know it's wrong. But I was weak." Clarissa's anger flared again. "You were supposed to protect me, not destroy me," she hissed, and ended the call. A wave of nausea rolled through her, a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil that had become her daily existence. That call set the tone for the weeks leading up to Clarissa's arraignment. She met with lawyers who advised her to plead guilty to a lesser charge if possible, to frame the attack as a moment of temporary insanity driven by extreme emotional distress. Public opinion was divided. Some sympathized with Clarissa, saying anyone might snap under such betrayal. Others condemned her as violent and unstable, unfit to function in normal society. Jason, for his part, stayed largely out of reach, releasing carefully worded statements through a lawyer that he was fully cooperating with authorities and focused on healing. His whereabouts were uncertain. He wasn't living at his old apartment or the home they were supposed to share. Rumor had it he'd fled to another state or was laying low in a friend's condo or had taken off with a new mistress. Every rumor stung Clarissa like a fresh wound. She oscillated between heartbreak over losing the man she'd once loved and hatred for the cheating liar who had set her life on fire. In the midst of this emotional hurricane, the day of the preliminary hearing arrived. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, snapping photos of Clarissa in a modest black suit borrowed from a cousin. Her eyes were red-rimmed, hair pinned back in a style that tried to project composure but couldn't hide her trembling hands. Inside the courtroom, hushed chatter fell silent when Marianne entered, her arm in a sling, flanked by her own lawyer. She looked like a shadow of her former vivacious self, eyes downcast, movements hesitant. People whispered as the mother and daughter glanced at each other across the aisle, locked in a heartbreak so deep no words could capture it. A hush fell as the judge took the bench. Testimony began with the responding officers describing the chaotic scene at the wedding reception. The bride in tears, the mother on the floor, the father frantically trying to staunch the bleeding. Cell phone footage was admitted as evidence, showing Clarissa wielding the knife, lunging at Marianne under the flashing lights of the dance floor. Clarissa's own voice echoed in the video, "How could you do this to me?" which she'd screamed right before she struck. Witness after witness testified. A close friend of Clarissa's recounted how she'd found Clarissa sobbing after catching Jason with Marianne, how Clarissa had been in a near hysterical state. A wedding guest described seeing Marianne and Jason slipping off together earlier in the evening. Another said they'd suspected something inappropriate for weeks leading up to the wedding. The hush in the courtroom was absolute as each new detail hammered home the depth of betrayal. Even so, the legal system focused primarily on Clarissa's actions. The district attorney painted her as a person who acted with violent intent, no matter how emotionally charged the situation might have been. Clarissa's defense attorney tried to spin the narrative that this was a crime of passion, triggered by extreme and immediate provocation. Then Marianne took the stand. She moved slowly, her face etched with regret. She admitted the affair. She described it as the worst mistake of my life, offering no excuse but referencing marital discontent and personal loneliness. She admitted that yes, Clarissa had walked in on them. She recounted that moment in the supply closet, how she froze when she saw her daughter's face, how she wanted to die of shame. She admitted to hearing Clarissa's guttural cry of betrayal before Clarissa ran away. The prosecutor pressed her, "Did you fear your daughter would harm you?" Marianne hesitated, tears brimming, before saying, "Not in that moment. I was afraid of what she'd seen, but never thought she'd hurt me." The gallery hung on every word. It was a rare spectacle to see a mother testifying in a case where her own child had stabbed her. No one could tear their eyes away. When asked whether she wanted Clarissa to face harsh punishment, Marianne's voice quivered. "No. She's my child. I've hurt her enough for a lifetime." The impact of those words was felt throughout the courtroom. A hush pressed in, broken only by the judge clearing his throat. The complexity of the situation weighed on everyone. This was not a simple case of right and wrong. It was a labyrinth of betrayal, love, hatred, heartbreak, and primal fury. After Marianne stepped down, Clarissa was asked if she wanted to address the court. Her lawyer advised caution, but Clarissa insisted on speaking. Rising slowly, she faced the judge, her mother, and the entire room. She spoke in a trembling voice. "I loved Jason. I believed he was my future. I never thought my mother would take that away from me. I snapped. I'm not proud of it. She choked on her words, tears coursing down her cheeks. "I'm sorry for what I did, but I can't lie. I'll never be the same." The hearing concluded with the judge sending the case to trial, though he strongly encouraged the parties to consider a plea deal. Prosecutors were willing to reduce the charge if Clarissa agreed to plead guilty, given the extenuating emotional circumstances and Marianne's willingness to advocate for leniency. But the father of the bride, Daniel, was incensed. He demanded real consequences for Jason and wanted accountability for Marianne's betrayal. The father, who once kept silent about so many things, found himself at the center of a moral and legal battle that forced him to reevaluate everything he believed about family, duty, and love. In quiet conversations, he would confide in close friends, "My daughter is no criminal. She was betrayed. But I can't say I condone what she did. My wife, ex-wife maybe, she's destroyed us." As the trial date approached, tensions ran high in Clearwater. Church groups debated the issue of sin versus forgiveness. Local TV anchors parroted the dramatic tagline, "Mother caught cheating with groom at daughter's wedding, bride stabs her on the dance floor." It was the kind of headline that fed the 24-hour news cycle for weeks. Commentators analyzed Clarissa's motives, Marianne's character, and the legal ramifications. Some turned the story into a cautionary tale about infidelity. Others framed it as an example of how easily violence can erupt under emotional distress. A few fringe voices even saw the situation as emblematic of broader social decay, blaming everything from eroding family values to social media's influence on personal relationships. Under this intense glare, Clarissa prepared for the trial with her lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Marisol, who specialized in family criminal cases. Marisol drilled Clarissa on how to speak to the jury, how to acknowledge guilt without seeming heartless or unhinged. She told her to show remorse, to highlight her emotional turmoil, but also to make it clear she was not a habitual offender. "In many ways," Marisol said, "the jury's going to want to see that you're a victim too, but you can't come off as manipulative. Just be honest." Clarissa nodded numbly. She often wondered if honesty would set her free or bury her deeper in public scorn. Meanwhile, the prosecution lined up its witnesses, wedding guests, relatives. The detectives who processed the crime scene, they had the stark, unassailable evidence of Clarissa wielding that knife. Intent was all they needed to prove to get a conviction. The mother's betrayal might be immoral, but it wasn't a legal defense. Clarissa's best hope, according to Marisol, was to land a plea agreement for a lesser charge like felony assault with possible probation and mandatory counseling. But the district attorney's office, under pressure from outraged citizens who believe violence is never justified, was reluctant to appear lenient. The mother's lack of cooperation only complicated matters. It seemed the entire city was torn between sympathy for Clarissa and the principle that you can't just stab people, no matter how badly they've wronged you. Eventually, the day of the trial arrived. News vans flanked the courthouse. Onlookers gathered for a glimpse of the disgraced bride. Clarissa stepped out of the car with Daniel at her side, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she entered, she noticed a cluster of her old high school friends in the hallway, whispering among themselves. A pang of shame and anger twisted her stomach. She wondered if her life would ever return to normal, if she'd ever be able to walk into a room without people whispering behind her back. Perhaps worst of all was knowing that her mother, the one person who should have been her biggest supporter on her wedding day, had become the cause of all this. Inside the courtroom, prospective jurors were being vetted. Some who recognized the high-profile nature of the case admitted bias and were excused. Others nodded solemnly when asked if they could remain impartial. The judge, an older man with kind eyes but a strict demeanor, worked to ensure fairness. Once the jury was seated and opening statements began, the tension in the room was so thick it felt suffocating. The prosecution painted a harrowing picture. A bride, humiliated by discovering an affair on her wedding day, decided to exact revenge on her mother in front of friends and family, demonstrating a premeditated act of violence. The defense countered, this was a horrific crime of passion triggered in the heat of the moment by an unimaginable betrayal. My client suffered a shocking emotional blow that left her temporarily unhinged. Over the next few days, witness testimony took center stage. Wedding guests recounted the day's events, from the joyous ceremony to the moment Clarissa brandished the knife. Some sobbed on the stand, describing the terror they felt seeing blood on the dance floor. Others admitted under careful questioning that they had suspected something between Jason and Marianne. That gave the defense an opening to show how deep the emotional betrayal ran, but it also forced Clarissa to relive every painful detail. The grainy cell phone footage was shown to the jury multiple times, each viewing driving home the undeniable fact that Clarissa committed the act. She flinched every time she saw herself in that white gown, eyes wild with heartbreak, brandishing the knife. Marianne's testimony in the trial mirrored what she said at the preliminary hearing, but this time it was under cross-examination from the prosecutor, who was determined to show that Clarissa's act was not just a momentary outburst. "Weren't you aware that your daughter had exhibited signs of emotional distress prior to the wedding?" the prosecutor asked. Marianne hesitated, looking to the defense attorney as if for rescue. "She was stressed about the wedding, yes," Marianne finally admitted, tears in her eyes. "But I never believed she would hurt me." The prosecutor pounced. "So you didn't anticipate that the mental state of your daughter, who you already admitted was stressed, could escalate to violence upon discovering your affair with her fiancé?" Marianne's voice broke. "No, I didn't think she had that in her." A murmur spread through the gallery. The mother's betrayal and her admission that she didn't see the violence coming were a tangled web of shame and denial. Then came Clarissa's turn to testify. She took the stand dressed in muted colors, hair pulled back, eyes heavy with the kind of sorrow that no amount of sleep could erase. The defense attorney led her gently through her background, her upbringing in a stable-seeming household, her achievements in school, and how she met Jason. She explained how the stress of wedding planning and the slow unraveling of her parents' marriage weighed on her. Finally, the defense asked about the moment she found Jason and her mother in the supply closet. Clarissa's voice quavered as she described seeing them locked in that intimate embrace. She felt a swirl of humiliation, anger, heartbreak. She explained how she ran back into the hall, tears clouding her vision. Grabbing the first thing that looked like a weapon, she admitted she was not in a sane frame of mind, that her rage consumed her. "I didn't think," she whispered. "I just reacted." And by the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor pressed, "But you did have time to pause, didn't you? You had to walk to that knife. You had to pick it up. You had to move across the dance floor to reach your mother." Clarissa clenched her jaw, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I wasn't thinking logically," she pleaded. "I was blinded by the betrayal." It's not an excuse, but it's the truth. The prosecutor hammered at her mental state, suggesting she had enough presence of mind to know she intended to harm her mother. Clarissa could only repeat that her actions were driven by an uncontrollable emotional breakdown. The tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. Daniel sat in the front row each day, sometimes burying his face in his hands, other times glaring in anger when the prosecution depicted Clarissa as a deliberate attacker. The mother, still wearing a sling, seemed small in her seat, as though the weight of her guilt pressed her down. When closing arguments wrapped up, the jury departed to deliberate. The room let out a collective exhale as people finally moved around, whispering opinions, assessing the body language of the jurors. Clarissa clung to her father, tears on her cheeks. "What if they lock me away for years?" she asked in a trembling voice. Daniel squeezed her hand. "We'll face it. You're not alone." While the jury deliberated, local news channels rehashed every detail, playing expert opinions from psychologists and legal analysts. Public sentiment had somewhat shifted toward sympathy for Clarissa, given the magnitude of the betrayal. Still, there were those who believed she deserved severe punishment to send a message that violence is never justified. It was a societal crossroads. How does the law handle crimes of passion in the modern era? Eventually, the jury delivered its verdict. Clarissa was found guilty of a lesser charge, felony assault under extreme emotional disturbance. She faced potential jail time, but the verdict left room for the judge's discretion at sentencing. On the day of sentencing, Clarissa stood before the judge, trembling. The judge surveyed the case, acknowledging the profound betrayal, but also stating that the law must uphold accountability for acts of violence. He condemned Marianne's behavior, though she wasn't on trial, calling it morally reprehensible, but ultimately laid the blame for the stabbing at Clarissa's feet. He handed down a suspended sentence of 5 years, with 2 years of probation and mandatory psychological counseling. The relief in the courtroom was palpable. Though Clarissa still felt a knot in her stomach, she was spared prison, but her life would never be the same. She would carry the weight of her actions forever. As she left the courtroom, news reporters thrust microphones at her, shouting questions. Daniel shielded her, guiding her to a car. Marianne stood on the courthouse steps, tears streaming, but Clarissa didn't spare her a glance. The mother-daughter bond had been severed in the ugliest way possible. Clarissa wasn't ready to face her mother's remorse, not after the betrayal that shattered her on what should have been the happiest day of her life. That final image, Marianne alone on the steps, her injured arm in a sling, tears reflecting her heartbreak, would make front-page news the next day, accompanied by headlines about the bride's sentence. It was over, yet it wasn't. The emotional fallout would reverberate for years. In the weeks that followed, Clarissa focused on therapy sessions mandated by the court. She moved into a small apartment funded by her father, who had quietly initiated divorce proceedings against Marianne. "I can't stay with someone who would do that to our daughter," he said quietly one evening, sipping a whiskey he rarely allowed himself. "I forgive you for losing control," he told Clarissa, "because I understand the pain. But I can't forgive your mother. Not yet." The counseling sessions forced Clarissa to confront her lingering rage, the sense of humiliation, the fractured self-pity that came from being the bride left for her own mother. The therapist, an older woman with a gentle voice, helped her unpack the swirl of betrayal. "You have to grieve, not just the loss of Jason, but the loss of the relationship you thought you had with your mother," she said. Clarissa found that notion sobering. She was grieving 2 relationships that had been pillars of her life: her mother's unconditional support and the man she believed was her soulmate. She spent many nights lying awake, replaying the moment in that supply closet. She blamed herself for not seeing the signs. She blamed Jason for being a coward and a liar. She blamed her mother for turning her wedding into a tragedy. Marianne tried to reach out a few times, leaving voicemails. "I love you, Clarissa. Please call me back." Clarissa ignored them at first, focusing on her own healing. She poured her energy into community service, volunteering at a food bank as part of the court's requirement. She found some comfort in the routine of helping others, in the quiet sense of purpose it gave her. Every now and then she'd run into someone who recognized her from the news. They'd stare, uncertain if they should offer sympathy or scorn. She learned to keep her head up, avoid eye contact, and push through. She was determined not to let this define her entire existence. She was more than the bride who stabbed her mother. Jason never reappeared, at least not in Clarissa's life. She heard rumors he moved out of state, living with a cousin, and maybe had a new girlfriend. Some said he tried to apologize to Marianne. Others claimed he spiraled into depression. Clarissa realized she didn't care which rumor was true. She doubted she'd ever love again, at least not anytime soon. But she also knew she couldn't waste time pining after a man who betrayed her so completely. 6 months after the trial, Clarissa tentatively agreed to meet Marianne in a public park. The mother arrived with a bandaged scar peeking out from under her blouse. She looked thinner, more fragile. They sat on a bench near a lake, an awkward distance between them. Marianne started crying almost immediately. "I lost you," she said, voice trembling. "You were the best thing in my life, and I destroyed it." Clarissa's eyes brimmed with tears, but she maintained a stiff posture. "Why?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Marianne tried to explain the unexplainable. Her marriage to Daniel was already a shell. She was lonely. Jason was charming. She admitted she never thought Clarissa would find out, never meant to ruin her daughter's life. Clarissa listened, her heart pounding. The betrayal still felt fresh, the ache sharp. But she also felt a stir of pity for her mother, a woman who made catastrophic choices in search of validation. They parted ways without hugging, but Clarissa acknowledged Marianne's remorse. It was a start, an ember of possible reconciliation. Time passed, as it always does, carrying the memory of that ghastly wedding into the realm of local legend. The event space where it happened changed its name, hoping to outrun the infamy, but in the city's collective memory, the story remained. The bride who stabbed her mother after catching her with the groom. For Clarissa, life became about rebuild. She enrolled in online classes to finish the degree she abandoned when the scandal erupted. She took her mandated counseling seriously, unraveling the tangled web of suppressed emotions, guilt, and fury. Gradually, her father Daniel found a measure of peace in single life, focusing on his work, occasionally texting Clarissa to check in. Marianne lived in a small condo on the other side of town, grappling with her mistakes, trying to salvage some semblance of dignity. Reporters occasionally reached out to Clarissa, hoping for an update or an exclusive interview. She refused. She was done being a public spectacle. She had no interest in capitalizing on the tragedy. She just wanted to live quietly and maybe someday find happiness again. Late one evening, as she sat in her modest apartment, she flipped through old wedding photos, those taken before the horror struck. She saw herself in that dress, smiling radiantly at Jason, with her mother in the background looking equally joyous. The photograph felt like a scene from another life. Tears welled up, but she reminded herself that she was stronger now than she ever realized. One day, as part of her therapy, she wrote a letter to Jason. She didn't intend to send it, but the exercise was meant to help her find closure. She poured out her anger, heartbreak, and regrets. She ended the letter with a line that surprised even her: "I forgive you, but I can't forget." She folded the letter neatly and placed it in a box with the remnants of her wedding invitations. Then she exhaled, feeling a small weight lift from her chest. That was the essence of her new life, coming to terms with what happened, carrying the scar but refusing to be defined by it. Months turned into a year. Clarissa found a part-time job at a youth outreach center, guiding troubled teens who reminded her that life can go on after crushing betrayals. She spoke softly but firmly to kids who'd experienced heartbreak, abuse, or family dysfunction. Her own wound gave her empathy, a way to connect. She began to see that her darkest hour could become the foundation for something meaningful, a chance to channel her pain into helping others. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it gave her a reason to keep living. On the anniversary of the wedding day, Clarissa visited the same garden where she had pledged her vows. The event space manager, recognizing her, gave her a polite, sympathetic nod and let her walk the ground. She stood by the floral arch, the memory of that moment still raw. She pictured her younger self stepping down the aisle, hopeful eyes fixed on Jason, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. She let herself cry, acknowledging the gap between who she was and who she had become. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked away. She understood that this day was always going to sting, but it would no longer hold her hostage. By the time her probation ended, Clarissa had undergone a full psychological evaluation, completed all her mandated service hours, and maintained a clean record. The judge commended her for meeting every requirement and showing genuine remorse. In a brief hearing that drew nowhere near the media attention of her trial, the court officially ended her supervision. She walked out of that courtroom free, though the emotional baggage remained. She climbed into a waiting car driven by her father and sighed. "I guess that's it," she said quietly. He patted her shoulder, a small gesture of comfort. "You've got a life ahead of you. Don't let this define it." For a moment, Clarissa was overwhelmed by gratitude for the man who, despite his own heartbreak and sense of betrayal by Marianne, stood by his daughter through it all. In the years that followed, Clarissa rarely spoke to the press. She tried to build a quieter life. Occasionally, she'd hear gossip about Marianne, dating someone new or volunteering at a local community center. She kept their interactions minimal, but they did share sporadic lunches, both women haunted by the day that changed them forever. If someone asked how she managed to not only face her mother, but also occasionally share a meal, Clarissa explained that holding on to the anger would only poison her further. She was determined to survive her own story. When faced with the question of how could a daughter stab her mother, Clarissa would always answer silently in her head, because sometimes betrayal is too unbearable to contain. She never excused her own actions, but that was her reality. She learned that accountability and forgiveness can coexist in an uneasy truce. Rumors continued to swirl about Jason. Some said he remarried and moved to a new city. Others claimed he was living abroad. Clarissa discovered she didn't care. She still carried a scar on her heart from his betrayal, but she had no desire to chase him down or see how he was doing. In therapy, she'd learned that sometimes closure is less about the other person's fate and more about your own healing. She kept that truth close, using it as a guiding star whenever old memories threatened to drown her in bitterness. The story of the mother caught cheating with the groom and the bride who stabbed her became almost an urban legend around Clearwater Heights. Over time, the details twisted with each retelling. Some versions claimed Clarissa killed both her mother and the groom, though that was obviously false. Others said Marianne had orchestrated the wedding just to humiliate her daughter. The only consistent piece was the moral undertone: betrayal can lead to unimaginable consequences. Clarissa learned to ignore those retellings. She couldn't stop the rumor mill, but she could shape her own life beyond the myth. She volunteered, studied, and eventually found a calling working with abuse survivors, discovering that her experience, as harrowing as it was, allowed her to empathize with emotional wounds. She sometimes joked ruefully with her therapist, "At least I got a purpose out of all the pain." Time marched on. Eventually, Clarissa built a new circle of friends who didn't define her by the stabbing incident. She dated sporadically, always careful to keep emotional distances at first. Trust was a fragile thing for her. A few men backed away upon learning her past, but one or two stuck around, seeing that she was more than her mistakes. She slowly realized she could love again, albeit differently, cautiously, with eyes wide open, but she refused to let fear of betrayal lock her away from the possibility of joy. Marianne, for her part, reached out more regularly in the second year after the trial. She wanted to mend the relationship. Clarissa remained guarded but made small efforts, like responding to texts or meeting for coffee. Each encounter was steeped in awkwardness and buried pain. "I know you can't forget," Marianne said once, tears in her eyes, "but I hope one day you'll forgive me." Clarissa offered a wan half-smile. "I'm working on it," she replied. She meant it. She was learning that forgiveness was less about absolving Marianne of guilt and more about releasing Clarissa from the chains of perpetual bitterness. Still, they never again possessed the easy closeness they once had. Through all of this, Daniel quietly supported Clarissa while maintaining minimal contact with Marianne. He finalized the divorce and moved into a smaller home. Father and daughter spoke often. On more than one occasion, he'd break down, lamenting that he should have been more attentive to Marianne's discontent or more involved in Clarissa's emotional life before the wedding day. Clarissa would comfort him, ironically reversing their old dynamic. That was the shape of their new bond. Two broken souls learning to support each other. It wasn't picture perfect, but it was real, forged in the aftermath of shared trauma. As the scandal faded from the public eye, Clarissa was left with her own personal timeline of events. From the day she said "I do," to the day she picked up that knife, from the time she spent in jail to the therapy sessions that put her back together, from the first time she dared to meet her mother after the incident, to the final day of her probation. Each milestone marked a step away from being the bride who stabbed her mother and towards simply being Clarissa. Again, an imperfect woman who suffered, sinned, and strove to rebuild. Years later, a distant cousin sent Clarissa a wedding invitation. It was the first wedding invite she'd received since her own disastrous event. She held the embossed card in trembling hands, memories flashing like lightning in her mind. Her initial reaction was to toss it, but after a long talk with her therapist, she decided to attend. She wore a simple, elegant dress, kept to the background, and did her best to smile in the presence of other guests. She congratulated the bride and groom with genuine warmth, though her heart pounded whenever she saw the wedding party gather for photos, or the bride dancing with her father. But she endured, forcing herself to stay and face her lingering wedding trauma. At one point, the bride, an old acquaintance, whispered, "I'm so glad you came. I was worried this would bring back bad memories." Clarissa smiled gently. "It does, but it's also a chance to make new memories. Thank you for letting me be here." In that moment, she felt a sense of resolution. She might never fully escape the shadow of that day, but she could slowly reclaim the joys of life that a wedding was supposed to represent. Family, love, the promise of a future. Betrayal had robbed her once, but she refused to let it steal any more from her. At the reception, as everyone stood in a circle, raising champagne flutes to toast the newlyweds, Clarissa lifted her glass as well, feeling the soft sting of tears in her eyes. She toasted not just to the couple, but to herself. A small, silent vow that she would go on, she would heal, and she would find grace in the aftermath of catastrophe. Even now, if you were to walk the streets of Clearwater Heights, you might pass the old event space, see the garden, and hear the whispers of that infamous wedding. But for Clarissa Davis, who once stood center stage in that harrowing drama, life is no longer defined by a single violent act. The echoes remain, but she has learned to speak louder than them. Yes, she stabbed her mother in a moment of uncontrollable heartbreak, discovering her groom and her own mother in a betrayal so deep it shattered her sense of reality. Yet in the intervening years, she pieced her life back together, slowly and painfully. She found her footing as a counselor, dedicating herself to helping others navigate heartbreak, betrayal, and the darkest corners of despair. In doing so, she discovered a path that might allow her to finally, one day, forgive herself and her mother. As for Jason, the father of that betrayal, she doesn't wonder about him often. The scars on her heart will always remind her of what he did, but she's chosen to look forward, not back. It's a choice born of necessity, a lesson learned the hardest way possible. Ultimately, her story stands as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of secrets, the primal fury unleashed by betrayal, and the delicate line between love and hate. It's about how a moment of blind rage can change everything, but also how survival and redemption can follow even the greatest fall. If there is any moral to be gleaned, it's that the human heart, once shattered, can still beat on, though it may always ache. And in that ache lies a reminder: treachery can tear you apart, but it's what you do afterward that truly decides your fate.